without further ado, our first topic, our first paper is the NAB Media over IP report, which is being presented by Thomas Bause Mason. Thomas is the founder of Open Media Consulting. His focus is on media over IP, file-based workflows, and emerging media technology. He earned a master's degree in media technology at the University of Applied Science in Cologne, Germany, and has worked at WDR, the Cologne Broadcasting Center, Accent Media, and NBC Universal. Thomas is involved in the NABA, VSF, and he is a fellow of SMPTE. Thomas holds patents relating to watermarking, 3D, virtual reality, and metadata tagging. Thomas.
Hello everybody, thanks for having me, and great to be here to talk to you today about the media over IP activities in the North American Broadcasters Association, or NAB. I'm here on behalf of NABA, and I'm here on behalf of the many people who were involved in the media over IP report at NABA, and who were also involved in creating a workshop which we just recently held in New York City. That was last week. So a lot of people were involved in this. My thanks goes out to them. The broadcast industry is on a journey, the journey of the digital transformation. And this journey brings us into new areas of technologies, and sometimes we don't know which road to take to get to these areas, or if there's a road at all. So this journey started with the transition from analog to digital, the implementation, for example, of SDI infrastructure, and then moved on to the transition from tape to file, and from there to central storage servers, systems with more automation, and then on to file-based delivery to consumers and business partners. The next step in this journey is streaming media over IP, and this presentation is focused on that. The workshop was focused on that. Let's start our journey today with a look at how we got to setting up this workshop and how we got together to make this media over IP report. I think we're on this journey together. We're sitting all in the same boat, and we have to row in unison and into the right direction to get somewhere on this journey. We have common problems to solve. For example, there are the new media formats, image formats, audio formats, which promise a more lifelike listening and viewing experience for consumers. To support, that's a top priority for broadcasters today. If you think about high frame rate, HDR, stuff like that, 4K, 8K resolution. To support these new image formats, you have to evolve your infrastructure. Broadcasters have to evolve their infrastructure. And IP networks are seen as a solution for that. But they're also seen as a solution for the move to the cloud. They're seen as a prerequisite to commodity hardware with software-only applications. And then with that into virtualization. And once you achieve virtualization, you can move in either on on-prem or off-prem cloud. All that infrastructure has to be secure. The infrastructure of broadcasters has to be protected from cyber attacks to protect our content and also to protect our infrastructure. Overarching of all of this is the need for broadcasters to stay profitable. We have to make money, and that in a more and more competitive market. So NABA is a vessel to kind of like support broadcasters in these transitions, in this journey to new infrastructure. And NABA is actually already working on some of these topics you see on the slide there. There are efforts in NABA to some of them. Let's look at NABA. What is NABA? NABA is a bit bigger than a boat. It's really concerned about the North American continent, and it is representing private and public broadcasters from Mexico, Canada, and the US. It is a sister organization of the EBU. It's through the WBU, the World Broadcasting Union, and it's advancing common interest for North American broadcasters, and we're working on developing common proposals for common problems to communicate our needs to the industry, and it's really a place where broadcasters can come together, work on common issues, find consensus, work on common proposals. Here's a list of NABA members. As you can see, the big North American broadcasters are involved here. We have quite a few collections of equipment manufacturers. There are different levels of membership with different fee structures. So if you want to get involved, if you think this is something for you, please join. Let's see how NABA supports broadcasters in this transition to IP. NABA members requested that NABA, the NABA Technology Committee, looks into media over IP and the transition to IP infrastructure. NABA set up a NABA Media over IP subcommittee, which I'm chairing, and we worked over a year to compile a report, the NABA Media over IP report, to detail the status of the industry and what's going on in the industry, but also collect a little bit of feedback for the media industry on what North American broadcasters think they need. Get also some recommendations for the NABA Technology Committee on what to do next. We published the report in April 2017, and we're now to NABA broadcasters and to the public. There's a list of companies who were involved in putting this report together. Fox, NBC Universal, Bell Media, CBC from Canada, NPR, PBS, Turner and Dolby. So quite a few big players were involved. Let's talk about the report itself. What we did, we really focused on streaming media over IP. We looked at professional live TV production within a facility, content exchange, live content exchange between facilities, and remote locations like news events and sports events. We did not consider file-based workflows. We did also not consider a hybrid approach, file-based streaming, and we didn't look at layer 2 technologies like audio-video bridging. We solely focused on layer 3 IP and above. What's in the report? We have a definition of media over IP. We hesitated to say video over IP because we felt it's not inclusive enough. There were some concerns by audio-only users that they're not represented in the term video over IP, so we decided to use media over IP instead to include audio, video, and data. We spent quite a bit of time on the motivation, why to move to media over IP. We did that because we felt that broadcasters, especially those broadcasters which don't have any experience with media over IP, to give them some reasons why they should move to media over IP. We spent some time on standards, looked at the available standards out there, AES, IETF, SMPTE, quite a list. And then we looked at technology and talked about transport, the essence in the transport, uncompressed, compressed video, uncompressed and compressed audio, talked about metadata, all that kind of stuff. There's a bit of discussion about flow management in the report. We also talked about what's changing for an organization, what is needed in operations today. But more importantly, we compiled a list of recommendations to the NABA TC and some consensus decisions. We backed all this up by a NABA member survey, which went out 2016, end of 2016, so a bit dated today, but nevertheless it went into the report. We didn't do this work in isolation, so we reached out to all these organizations there, AIMS, ESPN, VSF, AMWA, EBU, SMPTE, and JTNM. We asked them to come to our meeting and to present on their ongoing work, and all that went also into the report. So let's look at the survey quickly. Again, it was conducted at the end of 2016. We had 11 responses from 11 broadcasters to 21 questions, 4 categories we had, general questions, technology question, infrastructure questions, and NABA, what can NABA do to support broadcasters in the future? Some general feedback. These are summaries, so if you want to see more details on these on this survey, get the report. It's available on the SMPTE document repository, so you can get it from there. And these are just a summary of what the feedback was. Interesting enough, all the broadcasters involved in the survey said they had experience with media over IP, either as a POC or in lab environments. There were some implementations in UB vans, and there's some infrastructure, IP infrastructure, which is not used for actually production, but for monitoring purposes. So there's a concern of lack of standards and the early stage of technology. Interesting too was that all the implementations which were out there at that point, which were mainly SMPTE 2022 and Aspen, all of them said they want to move to SMPTE 2110 once equipment is available and the standards are published. All that together with AES 67, there was some mentioning of Ravenna, so people want to use Ravenna now and in future. 60% of the people said they want compression in their workflows, so where they were looking for media over IP infrastructure using J2K, TICO, or VC2 compression. The need for a control protocol standard was named. AMWA NMOS is out there, but it's not a standard. Some discussion about generic audio metadata. We had early adopter predictions of 2017, which I think is kind of on the spot. And then, but all these implementations which are out there are basically a large centralized switch, which is sitting in a sea of SDI. It's kind of an IP island. But in future, people want to move to more complex network hierarchies, looking at spine leaf, more like a virtualized data center kind of setups. So the virtualization and the cloud is on the mind of broadcasters. There's some voice the need for authentication standards to protect their actual, not only the content, but also the commands going over a network. And the focus so far was on LAN implementations, just facility, internal, island applications of IP in SDI. And lastly, down here on the list is what can NABA do? On top was be involved in standards development, be involved in interop testing, and all this. And really important, provide education. And in general, support harmonization across industry. So that's also a big topic for broadcasters. They want one standard. They don't want 5 or 6. Let's look at consensus decisions. We came up with a few. We felt technology was still kind of a moving target at that point when we wrote the report. So we came up with just a few, but on top of it is synchronization. North American broadcasters felt that they should support the implementation of the SMPTE ST 2059 set of standards, SMPTE for synchronization. So that's one of the consensuses. North American broadcasters felt that AMWA NMOS is the best approach to identification, discovery and registration, which is ISO 4, and then also connection management, which is, I think, ISO 5. But we also want to support AMWA, the network control API, which is ISO 6. It is really, they want to advocate the implementation and support the development there. Lastly, harmonization across the industry was very important, so we have a consensus decision on supporting the JTNM effort, the Joint Task Force on Network Media, which is now moving into a position where they act as a clearinghouse for all the efforts in the different standards organization. We became a member, so we're represented there, and it's an important effort for us. Recommendations, there were quite a few, so it's just a summary here. Standards, we looked at all the standards which are out there. There are quite a few, so we felt that there's a need for minimizing the set of standards, come up with a minimum set of standards which North American broadcasters should support. Problem there is we felt that SMPTE ST 2110, at that point when we wrote the report, and AMWA NMOS, it was too early for us to support it, but today probably that would be our recommendation. So minimum set of standards for us could look like ST 2110 for transportation, together with AES 67 for audio, then AMWA ISO 4, ISO 5, and ISO 6 for flow management, and then also SMPTE ST 2059 for synchronization. We talked a bit about coming up with recommendations for parameter sets, common parameter sets across the industry in regards to compression and also jitter measurement and latency measurement, things like that. Next, we discussed operating points. There's a section in the report talking about operating points. I believe now there's an effort in VSF to talk about operating points. But North American Broadcast felt it was important that we give users guidance on the capability of media over IP equipment so users can properly plan their infrastructure and build their facilities. There's a recommendation for NABA to work on virtualization, the cloud, and SDN. So I think there's some discussion about that going on in NABA now. There might be an effort next year. So it's still kind of like under discussion. Education was big in our discussion in the group. We talked a lot about education, and then there was also a point in our survey, which we got back from our survey, the need to educate North American broadcasters on media over IP. Again, generally speaking, be involved in NABA is not a place where you write standards. We look at other organizations like SMPTE to do that, AES and IETF. So we're not going to do that, but we are involved in these efforts. We're trying to be involved in these efforts and communicate our needs to these organizations and try to steer this process with the requirements of North American broadcasters. I want to highlight the point of education. That was the reason why we got together and did the workshop last week. A very high topic for broadcasters. They felt it's important to train their broadcasting staff on IP technology so that they're capable of implementing and supporting media over IP infrastructure. So let's look at the workshop. The workshop is a joint effort between NABA, AIMS, VSF, and SMPTE. We felt it's really important to underline this effort of harmonization across the industry and have a broad approach, get all these organizations involved. We had a North American focus, and we also said we wanted this workshop to be supported by the AIMS guidelines, VSF, AMWA specification, SMPTE ST 2110. You see the story there. We also wanted it to be user-focused, focus on the needs of the users and what users want and what they're interested in. We had a bit of a discussion, a session on standards update, and then talked about implementations, the various implementations which are out there. We're going to talk about that in a second. We had some discussion about operational needs and education, had some discussion about how that affects organizations, the introduction of media over IP. We provided some resources. We had a panel on gaps and what's needed today to make media over IP successful, and then talked about the future of media over IP and what's coming next after SMPTE ST 2110. We talked a bit of the roadmap. The roadmap was basically the JTNM roadmap, which is originally, I think, from the EBU, so many thanks to them for providing it. And we didn't quite get to consensus discussion, so that is maybe something we have to tackle next time when we get together. Let's look at the implementations we talked about. There was a presentation about an OB van using EVITS, so that was all based on EVITS technology, SMPTE ST 2022, and Aspen. So there's actually quite a bit of that out there now today. There was a presentation actually from Europe about SMPTE ST 2110 OB van. That was the first, I think, European OB van which was based on that technology. And then we had discussion presentations from two parties, one in Canada, one in Europe, which talked about greenfielding facilities, and those facilities are SMPTE ST 2110 based. So they want to do full IP and all ST 2110 I think there was also some discussion about using AMWA in all this. I think it's important to underline that SMPTE SD2110 is just concerned about the transport, and you have to also think about flow management and how you want to get these streams through a network, and then obviously the synchronization part of it. Two presentations talked about replacing SDI routers. So they were just basically thinking about switching out their SDI router with IP switches. That was all Evertz technology, EXE. And mainly the reason to do that was to save costs. They said there's a better scalability with IP switches. So it wasn't really because they were planning on building their IP infrastructure. It was more like how can we scale better in future. That said, they were all saying that they want to move eventually to IP and replace their SDI equipment. But the reality today is there's very little IP native equipment out there, so you end up with this hybrid SDI IP infrastructure. So we had some discussion in the panels. Just as a summary, I think the main topics we had there was the move to the cloud, what's involved there. There were some discussion about pain points, but that was kind of like an overarching theme in this whole workshop. We talked a bit about software architecture, surprisingly, the move away from monolithic software to microservices, kind of a software service-oriented architecture approach for software. So that was interesting, quite a bit of discussion about that. The JTNM roadmap I mentioned, there was discussion how the current implementation of, we discussed in the workshop, fit into that roadmap, and the general feedback was that we are slightly late, so we are not on spot, but we are still on track. Security was a topic. But there also a very simple approach. Most of the implementations we discussed were using a walled garden approach, so there wasn't, they just separated the networks, the usual IT networks from the production networks. And then followed for the IT systems in that walled garden network, it just followed IT best practices and updated their machines regularly and patched them. Again, we talked a lot about education and all this. Let's look at some of the takeaways which I had from the workshop. So my feeling was we were too early. We really scrambled to get people to actually come and present on their IP infrastructure. That can have many reasons. It could either because they didn't want to talk about it, or there's just nothing out there. So all the implementation we saw were basically Evertz Evertz EXE with ST 2022 and or Aspen. So nothing surprising there. The other takeaway was the lack of IP endpoints, which cameras like IP native cameras, which forces you into this SDI IP hybrid infrastructure, and which also kind of like I think was the reason for this big centralized IP switch with SDs, with lots of gateways, SDI IP gateways, and in this sea of SDI equipment. Network architecture, again, centralized switch, not much in terms of multi-switch environment. I remember there was some sessions in other events where people talked about it. We couldn't get them to discuss that in our event, so that was a bit of a pity, but so mainly centralized switch, that's the message here. Tools, there was quite a bit of discussion about tools, people saying when we implement media over IP, it's very hard to determine where the failure point is. So if your image suddenly goes black, it was very hard to tell where actually the issue was. They were asking for more tools to do this analysis. Maintenance tools are missing. Going up to a server and pulling your fiber cable and plugging it into some box to see what's actually on the fiber is pretty difficult to do today. And then let's see, virtualization. We talked about that, some virtualization approaches. We had a good presentation on issues regarding virtualization. and issues due to resource sharing. How do we, if you run 3, 4, 5 VMs on a server, how do you share the resources of the server, which also trickles down to some of the discussions which we have in SMPTE SD 2110 in terms of traffic shaping, because software-only applications tend to put out more bursty traffic, and some of the reasons might be in this resource sharing. Flow control came up quite a bit. We talked about that, and the need for a standard. AMWNMOS, again, we think it's a great solution, but there's not too many implementations yet. I saw some at IBC and then at NABA East. So there's some stuff out there you can get. And lastly, there were some complaints about PTP and support for PTP, which surprised me a bit because there's a lot of interop testing going on, and but people felt there's still a lack of support for PTP synchronization in equipment. So generally, we had a good workshop. The content was there. We had great content, and it was just, I felt it was a bit early in terms of having a really good discussion on this topic. What's next is really a discussion now. It was just last week, so we're just doing a bit of analysis, what we want to do. Obviously, one point is do it again. That's a bit of a question we have to pose to broadcasters if they're interested in doing this. We talked a little bit about doing the same event in a different region. Some said Europe, some said maybe on the West Coast. And I was curious, just a show of hands here in the room, who would be interested in having an event like this on the West Coast? Is this at all interesting? I see just 2, 3. Well, that's it. That's for me. Thank you very much for listening. And please let me know if you have any questions. I think we have 3 minutes. Okay.
Thomas, I'd like to ask one quick question. When they talked about education, since as a society we're all about educating our members, what, if any, recommendations were brought forth to educate a broadcast-centric staff on an IP-centric architecture?
Yeah, the discussion was actually more about what do we need to do to create this educational material. We felt there are lots of things out there like the Cisco CCNA you can do, and they're very IP network centric and not so much related to the media industry, to broadcasting. SMPTE has now a great effort. There's the Professional Development Academy. So there are courses there now which are kind of targeting more the media industry. So I think the general feedback was how can we create this educational content?
Hans from the EBU. Question: in the workshop, was there a debate about the flexibility what the new infrastructures are going to provide, and the new type of workflows which they will provide to the users in order to gain the benefits what we hope to get out of IP? Question number one. And have there been discussions about other barriers for adoption?
Other barriers for adoption? For the first question, there was a bit of discussion. There was one presentation which said for an OB van, not much is changing. So they showed us their schematics and said, well, it's going to be how it was before. So it's basically transparent. It's maybe more for an operator when you maintain networks. There are different tools now out there, so it's not going up to a rack and looking at a specific piece of equipment and see what the status is. It's a server room, so they're going to be virtualized dashboards which show you status. So it's more moving to how do you monitor your systems. And the other thing was I think the planning, how you do workflow planning, and it's just moving away from the more manual tasks to a computer-centric task. I hope that answers your question. And bottlenecks for other adoption, well, it was the IP, lack of IP native content. Education was named as one of the bottlenecks. Getting actually staff which knows this topic and can help with implementation. I think that was one, especially if it comes to the cloud. I think that's where it becomes very difficult. The same also for monitoring those cloud systems. I think we're running out of time.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.